Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we'll discuss the crisis within global capitalism with economist Richard Wolff.
Anyone who thinks that keeping England out of the European Union is some kind of guarantee that things will go better than they were before, that's all fantasy. That has nothing to do with what this is about. This is a fundamental expression of a mass anger of the working class all over the world against what is being done to a capitalism that I think has run out of gas.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not socialism, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolts en masse. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 ushered in an era of capitalist triumphalism. Neoliberal economic policies swept into the void left behind. But nearly 2 decades later, capitalism itself is in crisis. The 2008 global financial crash, the draconian programs of austerity and deindustrialization have shattered the belief that society should be built solely around the needs of the market. The public good, a cornerstone of democracy, has been abandoned, leading to a breakdown in social cohesion. Citizens across the globe are rising up. They are speaking in a negative vocabulary, the capacity to say no, to refuse to cooperate in their own exploitation. They understand, like Aristotle, that wealth is desirable, but not at the price of treason. Anya Parampil examines how Brexit fits into the unraveling of global capitalism.
Britain shocked the political and pundit class last month when they voted by a narrow margin to leave the European Union. They ignored calls from their then Prime Minister David Cameron, who'd urged a vote to remain, leading to his resignation on the night of the vote. However, his replacement, Theresa May, also of the Conservative Party, and opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, also campaigned to remain. Instead, they followed the lead of this man, leader of the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, Nigel Farage, as well as former London Mayor Boris Johnson, who will serve as Foreign Secretary under May. So, who exactly voted to leave? 52% of British residents, as opposed to the 48% who voted to remain. The vote to leave mostly came from England and Wales, though London voted 60% in favor of remain. Northern Ireland and Scotland also held on to the idea of remaining in Europe. The results prompted Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, to declare a second vote or referendum on Scottish independence may be imminent so that the nation doesn't have to leave. When it comes to the parties, 58% of Conservative voters were in favor of Brexit, while 60% of those in Labour were opposed. 70% of Liberal Democrats voted to remain, and 96% of UKIP members voted to leave. Globally, the markets, the media, and politicians responded with shock, proving this vote more than anything further defined the divide between those elites and the average voter.
Thank you, Anya. Richard Wolff is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst and a visiting professor at the New School University in New York. He is the author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. His latest book is Capitalism's Crisis Deepens. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you,
Let's begin with, because you've been writing about this for some years, this disintegration of global capitalism. Where does Brexit fit?
Well, the disintegration really takes a quantitative leap in 2008 with that collapse, the second worst since the Great Depression for capitalism, a very unstable system anyway. And the response to that crisis is really where the Brexit story begins. Namely, you've had years of a constriction of the position of working people in a capitalism that is finding it harder and harder to solve its problems. So you react to the crisis of 2008 by bailing out the big banks and the big corporations.
And by imposing austerity.
Well, I'll get to that. You bail them out, but how do you do it? You have to borrow a lot of money. So you borrow a lot of money, and then you go to your people and say, we've borrowed a lot of money, we've got to deal with this debt, And then the austerity becomes not how we pay for the bailout, which is what it is, but instead how we deal with the deficit, as if the deficit was the problem rather than the bailout that made it happen. So you've had years of austerity. The real wages in Britain, for example, are lower today than they were in 2005. So you've had like a decade of lost growth, of lost opportunity. The British people, like all Europeans, are facing lower wages, jobs with fewer benefits, less secure employment, and a cutback of government services just when they need them most.
There's a difference in terms of our economic system and their economic system, theirs, of course, being governed under the EU. And that is that governments cannot borrow to cover deficits, which we did, and they didn't.
Yes, absolutely. But the austerity is the story of Brexit. The people in Britain didn't vote for or against membership in Europe. I mean, that was the ostensible, but that was not why they arrived at the voting booth, because the truth of it is they had austerity from David Cameron and the Conservatives, and in Europe it's the same policy, so that the difference there is marginal, and they had just witnessed what Europe was prepared to do to Greece. They could imagine what it would be prepared to do to them. So this was rather an opportunity for the British to express the accumulated rage at what is being done to them. A system that isn't working very well, that's confronting them with decline and pressures in a downward way, and they've had it. They no longer can be told it's just a couple of years, we'll get us out of the woods, because it isn't changing.
Right.
And the prospect for their children is getting worse and worse. So there's a built-up anger. And I think it's no different from what might support a Trump, what might support in its own way a Bernie Sanders, what might be doing in other parts of Europe, similar kinds of things, because people don't know quite where to turn and how to solve the problem. But capitalism as their system is becoming more and more unbearable. And I think that's what these events illustrate.
Isn't the irony, though, is that countries like Greece, countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, for instance, are actually suffering an economic contraction that is worse, isn't it, than what's being happened in countries like Britain?
Absolutely, because it's always the weakest link. It's the country that has the least resources to fall back on, the least connections to where there still might be some viable activity. Look, Western capitalism, both in the United States, Western Europe, and even Japan, is moving to where it's more profitable. China, India, Brazil, and all of that. That's been going on for 30 years. That continues. And what they leave behind is residue. They're not going to spend money on it. They're not going to pay taxes to take care of it. And there's this slowly emerging awareness of the mass of people that that's what's being dished out to them. And that's a process of decades, not years. And it's beginning, I think, to become an awareness that they have. And they're beginning the serious search, and it could go left wing, it could go right wing, for what to do about it, how to fight back. But a vote like Brexit, like a decision of the French trade unions to say no to the very prime minister they put in, and the president they put in office, this is a sign that people are not anymore willing to believe that it's going to be all right. There's a rage against the very individual. Cameron went around, put his whole political career online, was defeated. Hollande has getting polling numbers now like George Bush in the last months of his presidency. It is revulsion, it is anger, it is bitterness.
It expresses itself, though, often in anti-immigrant sentiment, which, as the economist Michael Hudson, I think, correctly points out, is really a direct legacy of the endless war that has been waged by the United States, primarily in the Middle East, which has created these failed states in countries like Libya and Iraq, Syria, and this massive infusion of immigrants into Europe, which has exacerbated these economic tensions and, I think, fueled the ideology of the right wing. We're seeing now in countries, for instance, like Poland, Croatia, and others, which have really shifted to very frightening, rightist, almost proto-fascist governments.
I agree with it, but I would come at it slightly differently. I think it's difficult for the mass of people to get their heads still now around the notion that it's capitalism, this system for 200-300 years governing Europe, And so it's kind of easier to think the problem is the immigrant.
Right.
And to be angry at the immigrant, Lord knows they have the history of that. It's a convenient scapegoat. It's easy. But I don't think we'll overcome that kind of scapegoatism until people realize, and there are folks like me that work on this, that it is a systemic problem. It isn't conjunctural. It isn't these immigrants or those. They're not. You're not going to be in a better shape if you got rid of them. It's a fantasy that substitutes for what you have to face.
Well, but it's a very effective fodder in the hands of
Can be.
all proto-fascist movements seek to blame it on the vulnerable. Whether it's Muslims or undocumented workers or immigrants or whatever, then that's kind of what we're seeing with the rise of a figure like Trump. I mean, and we've seen, with Marie Le Pen, we've seen the growth, some Golden Dawn. We've seen some very frightening movements react to this, and at the same time, the left seems very weak. I mean, where are the socialists in France? They're certainly not represented by the mainstream Socialist Party or by Francois Hollande.
No, and the spectacle in France of these last several months, the streets of Paris,
where they've tried to roll back the labor laws,
change the labor laws in ways that every employer would welcome, that every unionist would fight, and you have the spectacle of a socialist president calling in the military and the police to beat on the very students and workers that voted that man into office. You're watching the self-destruction of European socialism like you had in Greece, now you have in France. These are all symptoms and signs of a system whose mechanisms of reproducing itself are not working.
And it's like the destruction of the Democratic Party in the same way when it turned against the working class on behalf of corporate interests.
Yeah, and I think that you're going to see a kind of reshaping of politics. Instead of a two-party model, it'll be at least three. You're going to have a right wing, a left wing, and the middle that is the shrinking leftover of what was dominant in the last 30 to 40 years. I think you see that emerging out of the fog, and it will be then a question of whether the left can really come up with a plan.
Great. We'll return after a short break with the economist Richard Wolff. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. Let's continue our conversation with Professor of Economics Richard Wolff. So Rick, let's talk a little bit about why this breakdown of capitalism manifests itself in these right-wing sentiments, anti-immigrant sentiments, authoritarian state sentiments.
Well, I think there are many reasons, as there always are, but I'd like to stress one. I think we're having a kind of return of a subordinated part of people's consciousness. What I mean is, there's long been an awareness on the part of the mass of people that the capitalist system is a system that is very good for a relatively small part of the population and very costly for everybody else. As long as there's enough to distribute around, maybe you tolerate it. But when there isn't, as there isn't now in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, then it becomes onerous to see the wealth concentrated the way it is. And I think, to make a long story short, the problem now is a dysfunctional capitalism leaves the mass of people with two choices: to turn against the system, to bring forward in their minds the criticisms they've always had, which now feel urgent, or to find a scapegoat. And the powers that be, they have a clear preference as how this should go. So you're going to find, and I think you already see it, that people who don't particularly share hostility to immigrants look the other way, find a reason not to be too critical, find a basis for an alliance with the scapegoat specialists, the right wing, because they're afraid of the left. They're afraid that the anti-capitalism will coalesce around a party or a figure, an important figure, and then have the muscle because it has support in the population. They didn't expect Brexit. They didn't expect these referendums to go this way. They're learning that they're out of touch with the mass of people, and that mass is anti-capitalist, and it probably is only a matter of time, and they know it, before that coalesces into a political force.
But aren't we seeing, for instance, the rhetoric of an Obama, the rhetoric of a Clinton, is to denounce this racialized, anti-immigrant expressions that come out of the candidate Donald Trump.
Yeah, but I think I give you a counterexample that struck me. In the horror of that Orlando massacre that happened, Trump right away made it up as if it were a Muslim issue. It had something to do with Muslims, which it didn't. And Mrs. Clinton felt she had to come in with a softer version of the same thing. So what I'm sensing is they're critical of that to hold on to their political base in immigrant communities, but they're not really fundamentally different about it. They just want to take it softer and easier. And you could see it in the immigration debates in the United States Congress and elsewhere. So my sense is they're not yet ready to go full tilt the way the right is, but all they're offering, as they do on every issue, is a messed up middle position that can't be, and they always have to keep it as though it's about immigrants, rather than explaining, which the left, I would hope, would do, that this is a displacement, this question of immigrants, from a fundamental systemic problem that unites all the people working, native workers, immigrant workers, in a system that is tearing them both apart.
So let's back off a bit and put Brexit in context of the disintegration of capitalism over the last few years, because it's just one piece of a kind of non-linear breakdown.
I think it's happening everywhere. That's why I think it's important to talk about the struggle in Paris, even though ostensibly it's a different matter. It's a labor law that makes it easier for employers to hire and fire, to impose overtime obligations and so on. But it's again pitting what in France is called le patronat, the ruling class, for lack of a better translation, against the mass of people. Students who began it, the Nuit debout, students staying up all night, and now the CGT, the most important federation of labor. And you're seeing it in Italy as the Democratic Party in Italy, named after ours.
And the Italian banking system.
Yeah, is falling apart over how to deal with this Italian banking system. Whether to go along, as they did back in December, with a bail-in, with this business in which a failed bank can take its depositors' money to help it out of a...
18% of the Italian banks?
18% of outstanding loans in Italian banking is non-performing. That is, they can't pay it back. Italy is now entering into a fundamental, delayed by a few years, because they're not as poor as Greece and not as poor as Portugal and Ireland, but now the big ones are falling down, like Italy. Spain is already halfway there. It's only left with France and Germany. It's beginning a shrinking circle of what can survive. And I think that's the sign that a capitalism is circling the wagons around its strongest members and letting everybody go. Sort of like in the United States, the image that we have of Cleveland, a downtown glitzed up with renovation to be the backdrop of the Republican convention. But if you go 3 blocks in every direction, you have one of the poorest cities in the United States with poverty levels. I saw the statistics of population in Cleveland because it's so dramatic. 900,000 people in 1960, 380,000 people today. It boggles the mind what you have done to destroy an urban culture in that area, all of which will be faked by the renovation of a downtown center. That's Europe.
Now, the American economy has a special component called imperialism, which makes us different in a way from Europe. And perhaps the situation becomes, for that reason, even more deadly.
Yeah, we're very dependent on that international connection in many, many different ways. And it is being stretched too, because as the system doesn't work, I mean, take a step back. When you move production massively, as we have for the last 30 years, from Western Europe, North America, and Japan into China, the whole point and purpose of it was to take advantage of very cheap wages. So you've replaced, basically, expensive workers with cheap workers, which means the purchasing power of the working class, viewed globally, has been dramatically dropped. And the wealth of the people at the top dramatically increased.
And we should throw in there, the way that they attempt to cover it is through debt peonage.
That's right. Keep the people in the United States and Europe happy by either government borrowing that then pays them or personal borrowing and all of that. But, you know, as has been written by more than a few critics of capitalism, this is a temporary fix.
Right.
Because in the end, you've then produced output that the mass of the people cannot buy back after they've exhausted their low wages and they can't borrow anymore. That's where we are.
Right.
And there's no way out of this except those who have will hold on tighter to what they have, and everybody else is in the water trying to survive. Very dangerous situation, especially for a population that can't see what I just said as its problem.
Right.
They will then look for, angry at this politician, vote for that part, but it's all treading water because it's a systemic problem, and we're not quite yet there at seeing that.
And I think I've heard you say that, you know, because Wall Street was essentially, bloated with federal money, it's back at its games of casino capitalism, which are not sustainable.
Absolutely. You see it everywhere. I mean, in Italy, to take the example, because it's now the key player, they're in desperate shape. Their banks cannot function. The capital of the banks is nowhere near enough to deal with the non-performing loans, so they can't get back the money that the depositors and creditors gave them. So Renzi, the leader in Italy, turns to the Europeans and says, you've got to help me, give me 40 billion euros. And the Europeans take one look at his situation, and they gave him 160.
Do we mean the Germans?
We mean the Germans with their European outfit on. No, the irony of Germany, that's a whole nother discussion. You're seeing a dominance of Europe by Germany, achieved by financial breakdown of capitalism much more successfully than the military power of Adolf Hitler was able to do. And that cannot be lost on the mass of the European people, because World War II is still too fresh in the collective memory. But back to Italy. The bankings, they asked for 40 billion, the Europeans gave them 160 billion. Why? Because they can't stand politically for another bailout to come. They don't want to hear from it. Give the Italians quickly a lot of money and pretend it wasn't there, because another dramatic moment where the failed capitalist financial sector comes to the public to be bailed out is not politically sustainable. The mass of people suffering will explode, as it did in Brexit in a little way. It will now explode. Even in Germany, the working class has been squeezed.
Right.
And they too have their grievances. They cannot be told, we can't help you because we're busy bailing out failed banks in Italy. It will not work.
So where are we headed? Where are we going to go?
Well, this is something that you and I have discussed before, but I am now of a new opinion that I've really only come to lately. This system is falling apart. I'm not an alarmist. I haven't thought that before. I thought that my life would come to an end, given my age, before I'd see that. I thought it would happen eventually. Eventually has just come a lot closer to me. It isn't working on a scale that is astonishing. They don't know what to do.
Right.
The out-of-touchedness of the Cameron government in England with what was happening, campaigning like blazes right to the last day, they didn't have a clue what was going on. I don't think Mr. Hollande has a policy, and he's doing crazy things to please the business community that has always hated him.
Right.
What is he doing? What is the Trump phenomena? Beyond the strangeness of it, it is the conventions, the assumptions, the things behaving normally, it's all falling apart.
Right.
And I think these are signs of a society entering into a period of extraordinary instability, explosive, disturbing events, shifts in consciousness. It's that famous saying, you know, beware if you live in interesting times, because they're going to be difficult. And that's what I see happening, and I see it in the economic realities all around me.
And that could express itself in, very frightening,
Absolutely.
and even terrifying
everybody
forms.
is trying to take advantage of it. You know, the most conservative politicians in England are now figuring out how they can make something out of this Brexit experience to get them into power. Anyone who thinks that keeping England out of the European Union is some kind of guarantee that things will go better than they were before, that's all fantasy. That has nothing to do with what this is about. This is a fundamental expression of a mass anger of the working class all over the world against what is being done to a capitalism that I think has run out of gas.
Great. Professor of Economics Richard Wolff, thank you for joining me. Every utopian promise made by neoliberal ideologues has turned out to be a lie. Democratic institutions have been weakened or destroyed. Economic inequality has gotten worse. The rights and wages of the working class have fallen into precipitous decline. Labor regulations, the protection of our manufacturing base, as well as labor unions, have been demolished. Corporations have used the destruction of trade barriers to carry out what is, in essence, a tax boycott. The aim of the corporate state is not to feed, clothe, or house the masses, but to shift all economic, social, and political power, as well as wealth, into the hands of a tiny corporate elite. This corporate elite achieves its aims of greater and greater profit by weakening and dismantling government agencies, taking over or destroying public institutions, charter schools, mercenary armies, a for-profit healthcare system, and outsourcing feed the corporate beast at our expense. Neoliberalism, the most grotesque form of capitalism, has created a world that is defined exclusively by the naked self-interest of the elites, and it is a world a growing number of its victims now openly reject. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.